There are photographs that pass through hands for generations without anyone truly looking at them. Framed relics tucked into estate sales, buried beneath albums in attic trunks, glanced at once and forgotten. This portrait from 1899 was one of them. Sepia-toned, formal, unremarkable in every predictable way. A family stands rigid before a studio backdrop. Mother, father, 3 children arranged by height. The kind of image you'd expect from the final year of the Victorian era. Stiff collars, somber expressions, the weight of respectability captured in stillness. But something is wrong. Takes time to notice. The eye wanders across the composition, the father's stern jaw, the mother's folded hands, the 2 boys positioned like sentinels on either side. And then, almost reluctantly, the gaze settles on her. The youngest child, a girl no older than 7, standing at the center. Her dress is pressed, her hair neatly pinned. Everything about her appearance suggests obedience. But her eyes refuse to behave. She is staring directly into the camera. Not in the vague, unfocused way that children often do in old photographs. Not with the dreamy blankness that comes from boredom or exhaustion. She is locked onto the lens with an intensity that feels deliberate, unnatural, and she is not blinking. In the soft yellow light of an archive room, a curator tilts the frame under magnification. The glass catches the overhead bulb, and for a moment, the girl's face seems to glow. Her pupils are fully dilated. The whites of her eyes are startlingly clear, untouched by motion blur or the faint tremor that usually betrays life in a long exposure. She looks frozen, not in time but in something else, something colder. The photograph was rediscovered 3 years ago, tucked inside a leather portfolio at an estate auction in rural Pennsylvania. No family name, no inscription, just a studio mark embossed in faded gold along the bottom edge. Whitman and Son, Portraiture, 1899. The buyer, a private collector of Victorian ephemera, nearly overlooked it. But once framed and hung, the image began to disturb him. Guests would pause in front of it. Some would lean closer. Others would turn away. It wasn't the clothing or the setting. It was her. Photography in 1899 required patience. Studio lights were dim, chemical plates slow to react. Subjects had to hold perfectly still for 10, sometimes 30 seconds. Blinking was inevitable. Movement was expected. Photographers used headrests and clamps to steady their clients. But even then, children squirmed. Eyes fluttered. Faces blurred. It was the nature of the medium. But this girl did not move, did not blink, did not flinch. Her siblings show the telltale signs of exposure. Softened edges around their mouths. A faint haze where an eyelid dipped halfway through the shot. The parents, too, betray tiny shifts in posture. But the girl remains sharp. Too sharp. As if she understood that stillness was not optional. As if she had been trained. The room where the photograph now hangs is silent except for the slow tick of a wall clock. Dust motes drift through a narrow beam of afternoon light, catching gold before vanishing. The curator steps back, letting the image speak for itself. And it does. Quietly, insistently. Why is she the only one not blinking? The question hangs in the air like smoke. No one in the frame looks at her. The mother's gaze is fixed somewhere beyond the camera, distant and cold. The father stares straight ahead with the rigid authority of a man who does not explain himself. The brothers stand like soldiers, shoulders squared, hands at their sides. And the girl, silent, centered, unblinking, watches the viewer as if she has been waiting all this time to be seen. There is no expression on her face. No smile. No fear. Nothing that might betray thought or feeling. Just the terrible clarity of someone who has learned that stillness is survival. The photograph does not offer answers. It offers only presence. A moment trapped in silver and glass, preserved long after the people in it have turned to dust. And at the center of it all, a child who refused to close her eyes. Or perhaps was not allowed to. The investigation begins not with the family, but with the camera itself. In a dim corner of the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York, a photography historian pulls a leather-bound ledger from a climate-controlled drawer. The pages crackle as they turn, each one filled with technical notes, exposure times, and chemical formulas from the 1890s. This is the language of early photography. Precise, unforgiving, and brutally honest about its limitations. In 1899, taking a portrait was not a casual act. It was an orchestrated performance, governed by physics and patience. The cameras of the era used glass plates coated in light-sensitive emulsion, requiring exposures that could stretch to half a minute under poor lighting. Studio photographers relied on massive skylights and reflective panels to flood their subjects with as much natural light as possible. Even then, the margin for error was thin. Blinking was the enemy. A single flutter of the eyelids could render a face ghostly, the eyes reduced to hollow smudges. Children were especially difficult. Restless, easily distracted, incapable of holding a pose for more than a few seconds. Photographers developed tricks, games, distractions, sometimes bribery, to coax stillness from young subjects. But even the most obedient child would blink. It was involuntary, automatic, human. The historian lays out a series of comparison photographs from the same period. Studio portraits from Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston. In nearly every image, children show signs of movement. A boy's hand is blurred at the wrist. A girl's eyes are half-lidded, caught mid-blink. A toddler's face is doubled, the result of a sudden turn of the head. These were accepted imperfections, evidence of life. But the 1899 portrait shows none of this. The girl's eyes are not only open, they are flawless. No motion blur, no softening at the edges. Her gaze is locked with surgical precision, as if she had become part of the apparatus itself. The historian taps the image with a gloved finger. This level of stillness, he explains, would require extraordinary discipline. Or extraordinary fear. There is something else. A subtle tension in her face that becomes visible only under magnification. The muscles around her eyes are tight, the lids pulled slightly wider than natural rest would allow. Her brow is smooth, but the faint crease above her nose suggests sustained effort. She is not relaxed. She is holding. Comparison to other portraits from the same studio reveals a pattern. Whitman and Sons specialized in family photography, catering to middle-class households seeking respectability on film. Their work was competent but unremarkable until this image. No other photograph in their catalog shows a child with this degree of control. No other subject stares so directly, so completely into the lens. Experts in Victorian child-rearing practices offer uncomfortable context. Late 19th century parenting manuals emphasized obedience, discipline, and the suppression of emotion. Children were to be seen, not heard. Stillness was virtue. Fidgeting was weakness. Some households took this to extremes, employing physical restraint or isolation to enforce compliance. A child who could not sit still was considered unmanageable, problematic, in need of correction. The photograph begins to feel less like a portrait and more like evidence. The historian returns to the technical analysis. If the exposure time was 20 seconds, as the lighting conditions suggest, the girl would have needed to hold her gaze without wavering for the entire duration. No child does this naturally. The act of staring at a fixed point for that long triggers involuntary responses. Watering eyes, the urge to blink, a reflex to look away. Overriding these instincts requires either intense training or an overwhelming reason not to move. Her posture supports the theory. Unlike her brothers, who stand with hands loosely at their sides, the girl's arms are pressed tightly against her body. Her shoulders are drawn inward, as if making herself smaller. Her feet are together, heels touching. This is not the stance of a child at ease. This is the stance of someone who has learned that deviation carries consequences. The light in the museum shifts as the afternoon wanes. The historian closes the ledger and steps back from the photograph. The girl's face remains unchanged, frozen, patient, unbearably still. She has been staring for more than a century now, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Not why she didn't blink, but why she wasn't allowed to. Names matter. They anchor the dead to the living, tether memory to record. Without them, history becomes a gallery of ghosts. Faces without stories, lives without testimony. For months, the girl in the photograph had none. She was only a presence, a pair of unblinking eyes suspended in sepia. But archives are patient places, and sometimes, if you dig long enough, the silence breaks. The breakthrough comes from a county clerk's office in rural Pennsylvania, where a researcher named Catherine Delmar has been cross-referencing census records with studio registries. Whitman and Son kept meticulous logs, client names, session dates, payment amounts. Most entries are routine, but one stands out. September 14, 1899. A family of 5. Payment, $7. And beside the mother's name, written in cramped, hurried script, bring the girl. The phrasing is odd. Not bring the children or bring the youngest, just the girl, as if she were something separate, something requiring instruction. Catherine traces the surname through the 1900 federal census, conducted just months after the photograph was taken. The family is listed, father, mother, 2 sons. But the girl's entry is marked with an asterisk, a clerical notation used to indicate uncertainty. Her age is recorded as 7, then scratched out and changed to 6. Her birthplace is listed as Pennsylvania, but a second hand has written unverified in the margin. Baptism records offer more confusion than clarity. A girl matching her approximate age appears in the parish ledger of St. Michael's Church in 1893, but the surname is spelled differently. The handwriting is shaky, the ink faded. A note at the bottom of the page reads, "Removed to home instruction, 1896. No explanation, no follow-up. School records should provide answers, but they don't." The local one-room schoolhouse kept attendance logs dating back to 1885. The 2 brothers are listed year after year, their names in neat, consistent rows. But there is no record of a daughter, no enrollment, no truancy notes, no evidence she was ever taught alongside other children. Catherine pulls property deeds next, looking for patterns. The family owned a modest farmhouse 3 miles outside of town, purchased in 1892. Tax assessments described the structure as dwelling, barn, cellar. Neighbors included 2 other farming families, a widowed schoolteacher, and a traveling preacher who wintered in the area. None of their surviving letters or diaries mention a girl. The silence is deliberate. In Victorian record-keeping, absence spoke as loudly as presence. Children who were sickly, disabled, or deemed difficult were often erased from public documentation. Families feared judgment, scandal, or the interference of church authorities. A child who did not fit the mold of obedience and health became invisible, hidden behind walls, spoken of in whispers. Catherine finds one final entry, a handwritten note in the private journal of Dr. Amos Fletcher, a country physician who served the area from 1895 to 1902. The passage is brief, dated November 1899, just 2 months after the photograph was taken. Called to the surname-redacted home, the mother spoke of fevers and sleeplessness, requested a tonic for the child's episodes. I advised rest and separation from excitement. The father would not permit me to examine the girl, said she was being managed. I did not press. The entry ends there. No follow-up visit. No name. Just the word managed, clinical, cold, and final. Catherine sits back in the archive room, the census page open before her. The girl's crossed-out age stares up from the brittle paper. 7. Or 6. Or something else entirely. A life measured not in years, but in corrections. A name written in disappearing ink. The photograph, by contrast, is permanent. Her face is clear. Her eyes are fixed. She is here, undeniable, even as every official record tried to erase her. And now, more than a century later, someone finally knows her name. But knowing her name does not explain why she vanished. Some houses are remembered not for what happened inside them, but for what no one will say. The farmhouse 3 miles outside of town is one of those places. It still stands, though barely. Siding grayed by weather, windows boarded over, the porch sagging under the weight of 100 winters. Local teenagers call it the Silent House, though none of them know why. The name is older than their parents. Older than memory. It has simply always been that way. A distant relative, a great niece of the family, agrees to speak on condition of anonymity. Her voice is careful, measured, as if she has spent years deciding how much to say. She was raised on stories, vague, fractured stories, about the family's reputation. Discipline, order, a household governed by silence. Her grandmother, who grew up 2 farms over, remembered the father as a man of rigid routine. Church every Sunday. Work from dawn to dusk. No laughter. No music. The boys were seen in town, running errands, attending school. But the girl, if anyone asked, the family said she was frail, sensitive to light, prone to fits, better kept at home. The great niece produces a bundle of letters, passed down through the maternal line. They are written in faded ink, the paper brittle and yellowed. Most are mundane, weather, crops, church socials. But scattered among them are phrases that catch the eye. The child has been taught stillness. She no longer cries out at night. Obedience has been restored. These are not the words of concern. They are the words of accomplishment. Progress reports on a project no one dared to name. A local historian, who has spent decades studying turn-of-the-century rural life, offers context. In the late 1800s, child-rearing was often framed in religious and moral terms. Disobedience was seen not as a developmental phase, but as a spiritual failing. Willfulness was sin. Correction was duty. Families that could not control their children faced judgment from neighbors, clergy, and community leaders. Shame was a powerful motivator. For some households, this meant strict routines and harsh words. For others, it meant isolation, locked rooms, restricted diets, silence enforced through fear. The historian leads the way through the overgrown path to the farmhouse. The front door hangs loose on its hinges. Inside, the air is cold and stale, thick with the smell of rot and old wood. The rooms are small, dark, even in daylight. The windows are narrow, designed to keep heat in and the world out. Upstairs, a hallway splits into 3 small bedrooms. 2 are empty, their floors littered with debris. The third is different. The door is heavier, the frame reinforced. A metal latch is mounted on the outside, rusted but still intact. Inside, the room is bare except for a narrow bed frame and a single chair. The walls are marked with faint scratches, horizontal lines, grouped in sets of 5. Counting, marking time. The historian does not speculate aloud. But the implication is clear. This was not a child's bedroom. It was a cell. Back outside, the great niece speaks again, quieter now. She recalls a story her grandmother told only once, late in life, about hearing a child crying from the farmhouse one winter evening. A long, desperate wail that cut through the cold. Her grandmother's mother had told her to ignore it, said it was none of their concern, said the family was handling it. The crying stopped by morning. No one spoke of it again. The farmhouse looms in the background, silent and indifferent. The windows, dark and empty, reflect nothing. Inside, the air holds no ghosts, only the residue of cruelty that was never named, never punished, never mourned. The girl's unblinking stare begins to make sense. Not as defiance, not as stillness, but as survival. Photographs lie by omission. They show only what the photographer chooses to frame, only the second the shutter opens and closes. Everything before and after remains hidden. But sometimes, if you look carefully, the edges of the hidden truth begin to show. The 1899 portrait was not taken for celebration. There is no joy in the composition, no warmth in the arrangement. The family stands like strangers, their gazes disconnected, their bodies angled away from one another. This is not a portrait meant to commemorate togetherness. It is something else. A specialist in Victorian photography practices offers a chilling possibility. In the late 19th century, photographs were sometimes commissioned not for memory, but for documentation, proof of correction, evidence that a problem had been managed. Families seeking to demonstrate control over an unruly child might arrange a formal sitting, creating a visual record that order had been restored. The girl's posture supports this theory. Her rigid stance, pressed shoulders, and locked gaze suggest sustained instruction, perhaps hours of rehearsal before the session. Her clothing is pristine, but not comfortable. The high collar presses tightly against her throat. The sleeves are buttoned to the wrist despite the season. She has been dressed to conceal, not to adorn. Her hands are the most telling detail. Unlike her brother's, whose hands hang loosely, hers are clasped tightly at her waist, fingers intertwined with white-knuckled pressure. This is not natural posture for a 7-year-old child. This is learned, drilled, enforced. The specialist pulls up comparison images, post-mortem photographs from the same era. These were common practice, a way for grieving families to preserve a final image of a loved one. The subjects are arranged with care, often propped in chairs or surrounded by flowers. Their eyes are closed. Their expressions peaceful or at least neutral. But there is a subset of these images that is less well known. Photographs taken not after death, but before, what some scholars call pre-mortem documentation. These were commissioned by families dealing with terminal illness, mental instability, or disciplinary crises. The images served as evidence that the subject had been cared for, that no neglect had occurred. They were alibis in silver gelatin. The girl's photograph begins to resemble these images. The same rigid formality, the same absence of affection, the same sense that this is not a moment of life, but a moment of proof. Her eyes, those unblinking, unbearably clear eyes, no longer seem like an accident of exposure. They seem like the point. She was instructed to stare into the camera, to hold perfectly still, to demonstrate that she had been corrected, that she was no longer a problem. The photographer, Whitman and Son, would have been complicit in this. Professional discretion was expected. Questions were not asked. If a family requested a certain arrangement, a certain duration of stillness, the photographer obliged. The transaction was financial, not moral. What the girl felt during that session is unknowable. But her body remembers. The tension in her jaw, the strain around her eyes, the way her small frame seems to fold inward, as if trying to disappear while still remaining visible. The photograph was not a celebration of family. It was a declaration of dominance, a final record that the child had been subdued. And it was taken just weeks before she vanished from every official record. Chapter 6. The disappearance no one reported. Death leaves a trail. Certificates, burial plots, obituaries, church records. Even in the 19th century, when child mortality was common and record-keeping inconsistent, most deaths were noted somewhere. A line in a ledger, a name carved in stone, a grave marked however plainly. But the girl left none of this. Catherine Delmar returns to the county archives, this time searching specifically for death records from late 1899 through 1902. She cross-references the family surname with burial logs from every church within a 20-mile radius. She checks the town cemetery, the church graveyard, even the potter's field where unnamed poor were interred. Nothing. The absence is glaring. The two brothers both lived into adulthood, their deaths recorded decades later. The parents are buried side by side in St. Michael's Cemetery, their headstone modest but legible. But there is no marker, no record, no mention of a daughter. A genealogist specializing in Pennsylvania Dutch communities offers insight. In rural areas during this period, unreported deaths were not uncommon, especially for children deemed problematic. Families that feared scandal or judgment might bury a child on private property, avoiding official channels entirely. A backyard grave, a corner of the farm, a spot beneath a tree that only the family knew. Catherine obtains permission to examine the property records of the old farmhouse. Ground-penetrating radar is brought in, scanning the area behind the house where the soil is uneven and the grass grows in irregular patches. The results are inconclusive. There are anomalies, areas where the earth has been disturbed and never fully settled, but no definitive evidence. The church offers another clue. In the parish ledger of St. Michael's, there is a blank entry dated December 1899. Most entries in the ledger include a name, date, and type of service: baptism, marriage, funeral. But this one is empty except for a single notation: private interment. Family request. No service. The priest who made the entry is long dead. But the notation itself is unusual. Private interment typically applied to stillbirths or suicides, deaths the church preferred not to publicize. For a child of 7, the designation is strange, troubling. A local folklore researcher contributes one final piece. In the early 1900s, rumors circulated about the farmhouse. Stories passed between neighbors in low voices. Some said the family had sent the girl away to an asylum. Others claimed she had died of fever and been buried in secret to avoid quarantine. A few whispered darker theories: that she had been locked away and forgotten, that her cries had stopped not because she was cured, but because she was gone. None of these stories were ever confirmed. None were ever investigated. The family did not speak of her, and the community did not ask. By 1905, the family had moved. The farmhouse was sold. The boys went on to marry and raise families of their own. In none of their descendants' records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, census forms, is a sister ever mentioned. She was erased, not just from records but from memory, from family trees, from the stories told to grandchildren. She became a gap, a silence, a space where a name should have been. But the photograph survived. And in it, she remains, undeniable, unblinking, staring out from 1899 with an accusation no one was willing to hear. There are images that haunt not because of what they show, but because of what they refuse to hide. The 1899 portrait is one of them. For months it has been dissected, analyzed, contextualized. Experts have weighed in. Records have been unearthed. Theories have been tested. But at the center of it all, the girl remains, silent, still staring. Her eyes tell the story her family never would. Child psychologists who specialize in trauma recognize the expression immediately. It is not defiance. It is not calm. It is dissociation, the thousand-yard stare of someone who has learned that presence is dangerous. Her gaze is fixed, but not focused. She is looking at the camera, but she is not there. She has gone somewhere inside herself, somewhere safe, somewhere they cannot reach. This is the face of a child who has been taught that stillness is survival, that movement invites punishment, that to exist visibly is to exist in danger. Her posture reinforces it. The rigid shoulders, the clasped hands, the way her body seems to contract inward, taking up as little space as possible. This is not the posture of obedience. It is the posture of fear, practiced, perfected, performed under duress. The photograph was taken on September 14, 1899. 2 months later, she disappears from all records. The timing is not coincidental. The portrait was not a family keepsake. It was a milestone, a before and after, proof that the child had been subdued, and perhaps documentation before a final decision was made. What that decision was, no one can prove, but the evidence points in one unbearable direction. A child who was isolated, erased, and ultimately forgotten. A child whose suffering was sanctioned by a family, a community, a culture that valued order over compassion. Her unblinking eyes were not a defiance of the camera's limitations. They were a response to something far worse, a life in which blinking, moving, or looking away carried consequences she had learned not to risk. The photograph does not capture a moment of stillness, captures a moment of endurance. And now, more than a century later, her gaze is finally understood. History is not only written in documents and dates. Sometimes it is written in faces, in expressions frozen by light and chemistry, in the eyes of those who could not speak, but could still be seen. The 1899 portrait has traveled far from that Pennsylvania farmhouse. It has been analyzed, exhibited, written about, but its power is not in its mystery. Its power is in its testimony. The girl's unblinking stare is not a question. It is an answer. She was here, she suffered, and she was seen at least once. Photographs like this one force a reckoning. They do not allow the past to remain comfortable or distant. They bring the forgotten into focus, hold them there, and demand attention. The girl cannot speak, but her image speaks for her. She has outlasted her abusers, outlasted the silence, outlasted the erasure. Her eyes remain fixed, patient, unyielding, waiting for someone to finally see her not as a problem, not as a correction, but as a child who deserved better. She is still waiting, but now she is no longer alone.